Welcome to this joint meeting of the Royal Society for Asian Affairs in London and the Oxus Society in Washington, DC. It is a pleasure to have such a large audience online and a testimony to the importance of the discussion we're having today and the interest that the world is taking in current events in Kazakhstan. For those of you who are new to the RSAA, let me extend a warm welcome on behalf of the Society. It's a particular pleasure to have our president, Professor Peter Frankopanm, moderating today's discussion, and we're fortunate to have a very distinguished and knowledgeable panel. With China and Russia as its biggest immediate neighbors and its wealth of natural resources, it is inevitable that recent developments in Kazakhstan engage international attention. But there is an important domestic political story to be told as well, and I hope that today's discussion will give us all a better understanding of how that has led to the current difficult situation. I will leave the introduction of our speakers to Peter Frankopanm. Before handing over to him, however, I'm pleased to welcome this collaboration with the Oxus Society and to give Ed Lemon the chance to say a few words on their behalf. Ed.
Thank you, Michael. And I echo Michael's welcome to everyone who's joining us from around the world for this very important panel. I'd also like to express my condolences to all of those who've lost their lives and seen their lives disrupted by the recent tragic events in Kazakhstan. The Oxus Society was founded 2 years ago at this point to be really a forum for research, for developing understanding of the region. And really this event bringing together a diverse set of perspectives is really one of the reasons why we founded our organization, to have a frank, robust discussion on important topical events related to Central Asia. So I look forward to hearing from all the different panelists and having a discussion on these important recent events.
Great. Well, with that, I'll take straight over. I'm Peter Frankopanm. As Michael said, I'm president of the Royal Society of Asian Affairs, and I've also been involved with the Oxus Society, thanks to Ed and many colleagues since it was set up. They're both terrific organizations. So if you would like to find out more online and join and support, more events like this will happen in the future. I'm incredibly grateful today for everybody joining us, giving up your time to follow today's webinar, and also to the five very illustrious speakers, many of who you will know, and you'll know their work already. I'll introduce them one by one. The aim is to run till about 2:45 UK time, so about 45 minutes. If you'd like to enter questions in the Q&A, I'll try and get around to as many of them as I can. Each of the speakers will talk for about 5 minutes on what has been happening in Kazakhstan and what they think may and may not happen next and how to get there. I'm going to start with Kate Mallinson, a very distinguished commentator on Central Asian affairs with Chatham House amongst other places too. So Kate, thank you very much for joining us. Give us your take on Kazakhstan, the here, now and tomorrow.
Thank you to Michael, Peter and Ed this morning and this afternoon. Good morning. As well as being an associate fellow at Chatham House, I'm also a political risk analyst. And I've been traveling to Kazakhstan since 1990 and working on political risk in Kazakhstan for the last 21 years. This involves frequent travel to the region. And the main thing I've really been doing is analysing the political risks in the country, which is looking at political stability, essentially. And over the last 15 years, what I've really been looking at is the kind of palpable growth of disaffection that's been rising among the population. Simultaneously, my pet subject is the informal political economy in Kazakhstan, where I've been mapping the ownership of the country's significant asset base. And I've always contemplated how the map would look if you removed first President Nursultan Nazarbayev, his family and his friends from the center of the map. And incredibly today, this is a real potential scenario and would be a total game changer for the country. This leads me on to my first point, which is how genuine really are President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev's statements about curtailing the power of the Nazarbayev family and the Kazakh elite. Over the last 20 years, we've heard so much rhetoric about changing and modernizing Kazakhstan and the various reform programs. It's become quite hard to believe how true these latest statements really are, or is it just for domestic and as well as global consumption? we're really sitting at a major inflection point for Kazakhstan today. Can President Tokayev do something that neighboring President Shavkat Mirziyoyev in Uzbekistan has sort of failed to do? And that is formalize the informal hidden constitution whereby the elites control the main resource rents and make the system, and can he actually make the system about institutions and not about personalities as it is today? Or will he need to accommodate some of the elites to shore up his power? Tokayev's new cabinet shows how short the substitution bench is. The government needs to change legislation to allow the thousands of brilliant, well-educated, reform-minded and uncompromised Kazakh executives into the government. These initial cabinet appointments are rooted in the Nazarbayev era, and some are even close allies of arrested elites. Hopefully this is only temporary so that Tokayev can keep the show on the road whilst finding out where the money flows are going before changing the system. Secondly, Tokayev has urgently to try and regain the trust of various segments of the Kazakh population, including the younger, more rural Kazakh speakers who've not benefited from modernization and do not have ties to Russia, as well as the urban, educated Russian-speaking Kazakhs, many of whom have done quite well in the last 30 years. He must also prove that Kazakhstan will not lose out in any quid pro quo in return for Moscow's CSTO support in quelling the power coup. What took place in Kazakhstan this month is multifaceted and extremely complex, even for people who've been watching the country for its 30 years of independence. The picture is complicated further by misinformation, an information void, and international media conflating genuine protests with insurrection. An independent investigation is urgently required, but barely conceivable, as the confluence of the Soviet legacy, in my opinion, and as the secretive kind of neo-patrimonial system of power have left most Central Asian governments averse to telling the truth. A likely grand bargain with his predecessor, whereby Nazarbayev is not discredited, would mean Tokayev is unlikely to reveal that the Nazarbayev family essentially threw Tokayev under the bus. Under the grand bargain with the Nazarbayev family, President Tokayev is likely giving the Nazarbayev family some time to restructure their assets while returning some money to the country. He's also making signals that he's willing to work with some remnants of the Nazarbayev family. And unless he can show to the people an obvious off-ramp from the Nazarbayev epoch, he will not be able to fulfill his pledge to bring Kazakhstan into a new era and to take the people with him. And finally, in spite of the billions of dollars that's been spent on global companies doing PR and branding for Kazakhstan, I would say that former President Nazarbayev was shown to be an emperor with no clothes, and Kazakhstan's international image has been left in tatters by the attempted palace coup and the armed insurrection led by well-trained mercenaries on the streets of Kazakhstan's commercial capital, Almaty. I think President Tokayev would do well to genuinely disassociate himself from his predecessor in the forthcoming months, and we can see a new chapter in Kazakhstan's history. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. There's an enormous amount to think about there and to talk through, and it'll be very interesting to hear some of the panelists said they'll choose to pick up some of those points, or perhaps we'll do in the Q&A. Next, I'm going to pass to Joanna Lillis. Many of you will know from her book, Dark Shadows, and the work that she does for The Economist and elsewhere in EurasiaNet, a fine voice representing outside views of Kazakhstan from the inside and knows the region extremely well, having moved there, I think, when we met last time, Joe, in the 90s. You're now in Almaty, so tell us how things look on the ground and how do you see the here, now and tomorrow for the country?
Thank you, Peter, and thanks to all our hosts. So, as you said, Peter, I've lived in Kazakhstan for a long time. I've lived in Central Asia for 20 years, and 17 of those years I've lived in Kazakhstan. I personally am reeling from, left reeling from what's been going on in Kazakhstan. And, you know, I think everyone in the country, almost everyone in the country is in shock. And I think that goes to my next door neighbor, for example, who I bumped into on the street yesterday, right up to President Tokayev. I think that we can see from his reactions, from some of his speeches and from the way he has looked. So how do things look on the ground? Well, this afternoon, I've been walking through the charred remains of Almaty City Hall, and that's left me also very, very shocked. There's very little left of City Hall inside. That's a seat of power. That's a real symbol for the city of Almaty, built in the 1980s and once the headquarters of the Communist Party of the Central Committee, sorry, of Soviet Kazakhstan, Central Committee of the Communist Party that ruled Kazakhstan in Soviet times, and then became City Hall. And it's an enormous, very symbolic, not beautiful, but monumental building that we have the mountains of the Tianshan Mountains in the background, and then Almaty City Hall looks right down over the city, and it's a projection of power. As a little personal thing, during the pandemic, I found it was a great spot for sundowners, to take my own sundowners with friends, and we'd drink and watch the sunset from the steps of City Hall. That's a memory that is personal to me. So walking through City Hall today, it's really very shocking. The scenes inside are very eerie. There's dust swirling around some of the former rooms. I say former rooms because many of the walls have gone. Almost everything has gone from inside. I had no idea from the outside just how bad it was going to be. Almost everything is gone from inside. There's dust swirling around. There is the smell of smoke lingers. There is glass crunching underfoot. And as I say, almost nothing left inside. There's a table that some of the officials told me they believe it might have been brought in by the people who took over City Hall, because as I was told, it wasn't there before, a table with lots of chairs around it. Who heaven knows if they are having meetings around it or what. So as I said, it's really, really shocking sights, and it leaves no doubt. If anyone still has any lingering doubts, that there can be no possible doubt of the level of organization for people who could gut that entire massive building and leave virtually nothing left inside. So that's the first thing I want to say. Secondly, what Kate mentioned about President Tokayev and his remarks, or his what he said about this. He has said it's an attempted coup d'etat, an attempt to seize power. There's plenty of evidence for that. He's also talked very vaguely about terrorists, extremists, bandits. Kate has already said this, but President Tokayev really needs to call a spade a spade. He really needs to tell us who is behind this. Who did it? Was it elements of the Nazarbayev family? Well, for his own security, as well as for the sake of transparency and openness, he needs to tell us who is behind this, and he needs to move against those people. He doesn't need to cut deals. He needs to move against people, and he needs to arrest them, and he needs to put them in jail where they belong. And finally, but most importantly at this point, perhaps, I have serious grave concerns about human rights and access to justice. We have 12,000 people in jail cells now. Unfortunately, Kazakhstan's judicial and law enforcement systems are despite many years of reforms, they remain very much entrenched in their Soviet past. Although on paper, innocent until proven guilty is the principle, in my experience, the opposite is true. It's very difficult when one is arrested, anyone in Kazakhstan, to come out clean and to come out without being charged, because there is a presumption of guilt before innocence. And I'm very concerned about access to justice for all those people. Many of them must include innocent people who got swept up in the dragnet, and I think we really need to see some assistance, an international investigation, of course, but also we need to see a real commitment from President Tokayev to give justice to these people and to make sure justice is done. We had a lot of talk about open justice when the Zhangwazhen shootings happened a decade ago. And what's being said, in the corridors of power in the capital is not the same as what happens on the ground. We have plenty of evidence and plenty of allegations so far of mistreatment of detainees. We've seen evidence of people coming out blooded and beaten. And so, as I say, access to justice and secure human rights, big concerns. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Joe. Just for clarity, I saw some of the pictures you posted this morning of Almaty and the City Hall. Could you just underline what your perception therefore is about organisation? You mentioned about organised groups. Does that mean that you see this as non-spontaneous from the protest that started in the west of the country, and you see these as two separate things, or do you see that those two are related?
I definitely see two separate things. I definitely think, I'm almost sure the protest was spontaneous that began in Zhanghaozhen. I mean, we can talk more about that, but we all know there's been major socioeconomic grievances among many people in Kazakhstan all over the country, and often Zhanghaozhen is a hotbed of of these kind of things. I think they were spontaneous. They rolled out across the country spontaneously, parts of the country anyway, and then they were, as President Tokayev has said, hijacked by violent forces. Now we don't know who these people are, but we have seen, and he talked of well-trained people. He talked of 20,000 fighters. Well, maybe there were 20,000, but who they were, I think the problem being that calling them terrorists is really muddying the waters here. So yes, I do believe that there are people accessed with organized crime has almost certainly been involved. We've seen videos of people known as mobsters sort of talking about their involvement. So organized crime got involved, and maybe some radical elements all coming together in some kind of nexus of forces that were harnessed to sow chaos. Whether to seize power or not, well, we'll see, but it certainly looks likely.
Fantastic. I'll next come to Raushan Jandayeva, who is a PhD student at George Washington University in the US, working on identity in post-Soviet states. I've heard Raushan talk very eloquently in recent days in a few different forums. Raushan, how do you see these last few days, and what comes next?
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Great. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, as previous speakers have mentioned before, there's just a lot of unknowns on the ground, and especially for us, for someone who's abroad. But what I want to do now is just to provide some context of what we actually know. As everyone knows, the whole event started on January 2nd in Zhanghaozhen due to fuel price spike. But it's important to realize, and I think people realize it now, that it was just a trigger and was not a single spate of anger. And because of that, we need to understand the situation, that it's complex, and that it requires further contextualization. It's important to understand here that contentious politics was present in Kazakhstan long before that. Here we can go back to the work of James Scott on the power of the weak, and like daily acts of resistance that Kazakhstani people exhibited. But unfortunately, because those are sort of less visible, we didn't monitor them. But I think an excellent way to look at some of them is just to look at the arts produced by Kazakhstani artists. And here you can, there is a famous Kazakh scholar, Diana Kudaybergenova at University of Cambridge, that works on that. That's probably something you can explore if someone is interested in sort of public dissent. In terms of the actual sort of bigger protests, the watershed moment was obviously Zhanghaozhen in 2000, like 10 years ago. And that imprinted in people's like sort of imagination, people's mind, and became a part of sort of protest culture and national identity. Further, we saw a big protest in 2015 due to tenge devaluation, in 2016 due to selling of land to China, in 2019 when there was sort of the symbolic power transition where people felt this window of opportunity for political change. And at the same time, we also saw emergence of political and social movements, including Oyan Kazakhstan or Wake Up Kazakhstan. It's a group of young activists, as well as more populist movements like the one of Janbolat Mamai. At the same time, while we had those big protests, we also saw smaller protests. And here I can refer to the Oxus protest tracker, which tracks protest events in 5 Central Asian countries. Within 2 years, that the the tracker monitored, there were about 1,000 protests, and mostly, like 50% of them were in Kazakhstan. People demanded various socioeconomic and political reforms long before 2022. So here I want to point out again that the complexity of the situation, and we as social scientists, we try to aggregate things often and try to answer who an average protester is. But within this conditions, it's really hard to tell, simply because there are just multiple actors involved in terms of domestic protesters, but also regime, elites, foreign actors as well. It's also important to realize that the protests were not homogeneous. There's definitely a heterogeneity on the ground in terms of groups, but also we could see the groups were geographically clustered, and because of that, it's sort of harder to track the demands that various groups sort of pursued. And because of that, we also saw how protests unfolded differently in different regions. If the protests in the western part of Kazakhstan remained largely peaceful, what we saw in Almaty was sort of more of an aberration rather than a normality. Well, just to conclude, again, there is lots of unknowns. There is definitely a lot of things we need to figure out within the coming month, and the most important thing is just to collect the information from the eyewitnesses now that the internet is sort of more or less stable in Kazakhstan. We just need to work on that. As for now, there are a lot of speculations on what's going to happen, who are the terrorist groups, so-called terrorist groups, what the elite split is about, etc. But thank you. I'm going to end here.
Thank you, Rashan. Rashan, do you think that do you fear that the moment for reform is also passing with each day? All the moments of trying to push for liberalization, do you think that will get lost in the process of the coming weeks and months, or are you still hopeful that significant reforms that Kate and Joanna have already mentioned might now take place?
I'm definitely hopeful about the sort of people and political culture and civic culture that we saw on the ground these days. About the government itself and the reform that President Tokayev outlined, there are definitely socioeconomic reforms, but in terms of the political reforms and political freedoms, there is still a lot of work to be done. We could see that out of 18 ministers, 11 of them served in the previous cabinet, and I don't know if it's really suggestive of like large systemic reforms.
Okay, thank you very much. Last, oh no, not, I beg your pardon, penultimate, Alimana Zhamukhanovna. Again, I've heard you speak, Alimana, in the last few days with great eloquence too. Do you agree with Raushan, Kate, and Joanna? Tell us how things look from your perspective. Alimana is with the UN immigration program and also heavily involved with the Oxus Society. So thank you for joining us too.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to speak here, and it's great to speak with you all today. I just want to start by saying that I don't represent any of the IOM UN views. I'm speaking independently for myself. And as Raushan, I was born in 1996 in independent Kazakhstan. And for me and for Raushan and for other young Kazakhstani, and maybe even the generation of my parents, it's such a huge shock to see what is happening and what just happened in Kazakhstan, because we have never seen a crisis that got to that big scale before. And I think although it's very bitter now to see this all happening and the way it was handled and how many people died, at the same time, I'm really hopeful that people are getting interested in politics because before that, as growing up, and I'm sure Raushan will agree with me on that, we were not very political. And for example, from my parents' generation, from my aunts and uncles, I would see that politics, it was something far away in Astana and held in Akorda, but they were not politicized. But now I can see that everyone is concerned about what's happening. Everyone wants to know what happened and what will happen. And so like this culture of being politicized is growing in Kazakhstan, which might lead to positive changes in the future. But also, I think it's really important for Kazakh state, this crisis, because before that, I think it also was really hard to consolidate and really build a nation building, especially considering the ethnic composition of Kazakhstan, which was really complicated, and we inherited that from the Soviet Union. But through the years, and I think it also just been like in the recent years with emergence of political art, we can see that people are they are more patriotic, they're more national, like the national nation building is really like present in their lives, and that's why it's more, they're getting more political and they want to participate and they want to know what government is doing. But also I agree with everything Roshan has said. A lot of it is what we have also said in our article that we published, but it's also important to notice that there's a lot of theories of what happened, and there's a lot of confusion because even people on the ground, they don't really have the full grasp of what happened. And there are a lot of different evidences that coming, for example, like airport not being, that was not really protected, although the protests got really intense in Almaty. And there's a lot of question of army and police was not, they were not listening to the government, and they didn't do what they said. So the government got into a vulnerable position, or their criminal groups, terrorist groups, what happened? There are no clear messages from the government, and I think also it makes people not really trusting government because we don't see the clear sort of explanation of what really happened and what the events were like, and it's also hard to believe. That's why it's like a lot of conspiracy theories coming from everywhere, even from outside of Kazakhstan, from Russia and all the interested countries, which also makes the situation in Kazakhstan very difficult to kind of contextualize. But what I also want to bring your attention is that we also need to be careful and try to get past maybe through this of like trying to figure out what happened and try to come back to the initial, so to say, spark, right? Which was the public discontent and demand for change and the protesters, because I think a lot of it we're getting into trying to figure out if there's the elite turmoil inside what was happening, if there's like Nazarbayev, his nephew, there's like a lot of different theories, but at the same time, there's like now less attention to the actual protesters in the beginning that they were brave enough to demand their political demands. And that's why it's very important for Kazakhstan, as before, the protest culture was not as strong. And it's also an indicator that it's getting really strong, and it can get to a point that can be quite hard to manage. And that's also what we say in our article, as we're pointing out to different events that happened and kind of led to 2022, as there were many different events that kind of brought the discontent to the public, but were not addressed in a way that it would satisfy. So as they were brewing up and kind of exploded. So I guess that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali Mana. I'm going to try to multitask and put a link to that article in Foreign Policy in the chat box for everybody to follow up and read after this event. Please do put your questions in the Q&A. The last speaker is His Excellency Elan Idrisov, the former Foreign Minister of Kazakhstan, former Ambassador to the United States, and currently the Ambassador to the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland, an extremely experienced diplomat, civil servant, and government representative. We're extremely grateful to you, Ambassador, for joining us today. I know this has been a difficult time for all Kazakhs of all political persuasions and all with families back at home trying to work out what's going on. We're extremely grateful to you for giving us a position. If you want to distinguish between your own views, the diplomatic view, and the views of your government, please do so. But we're very grateful to you for sharing us the opportunity to give this from your perspective, the government perspective, and perhaps to take on some of the points that have been raised by our four speakers. But over to you, Your Excellency.
Thank you very much, Peter. First of all, let me express my sympathy and condolence, of course, to those who suffered in Kazakhstan. This is really a challenging situation. Secondly, of course, Peter, I would like to thank you and organizers, and I'd like to welcome all the panelists, my friends, Kate, Joanna. I don't know Alimana and Raushan, but I'm happy that they're representing the young generation of Kazakhstan. I'm that old generation. My kids are the same age as Raushan and Alimana, and of course, we have our own family debates in the family at home. But I understand that the space is short, and let me be brief. While it is very difficult for Kazakh to be brief, but anyway, I'll try. Let me start with the background. We understand that so much has been said, so much has been commented on. So I will skip the well-known facts, but my recapitulation of the situation is following. First of all, we should not forget that Kazakhstan is not existing in a vacuum. We live in a world. And the world which we see today is a world of global economic decline, protracted, never-ending pandemic, and all the hardships which come with it. Kazakhstan was not kind of something which was not taken by these global trends. And of course, despite of the massive government support packages exceeding $10 billion, still the general public in Kazakhstan was victim to these economic hardships, which were exacerbated by the difficulties of the pandemic time over the last 2 years. We should know that the focus for the 22 was not very optimistic. Most of the focus for 22 was also economic hardships, continued pandemic, and all the inconveniences and things which will haunt people's life in day-to-day situations. Of course, like in any country, the bulk of the population was taking the burden of these hardships. So that was the background and the situation. Of course, very unhappy trigger took place in early January when everyone was relaxed, but overnight when people were spending their New Year's. And let me remind you that for Kazakhs, the New Year night, 31st of December to 1st of January, is the most sacred, most family and featured holiday, like Christmas in the West. So everyone was at home and everyone was talking about what they're expecting in the 2022. And this pessimistic focus was, of course, not the best background for this trigger to happen And I tell you that I agree that during the first days, the protests were genuine. They were based on the massive economic hardships felt by the bulk of the population. That's a reality. Therefore, this protests, they spread so quickly around Kazakhstan. Very quickly, this situation was misunderstood and mispresented both internally and externally. The two main lines were that the government reacted disproportionately, that particularly gross misinterpretation of President Tokayev's shoot to kill order was the main line over there and outside of Kazakhstan. Second main line was that Kazakhstan is compromising and actually surrendering its independence with the arrival of CSTO forces. Let me tell you briefly how I take this. I, of course, do not take those 2 points, and I was very unfortunate to see that this misrepresentation of what was happening in Kazakhstan took place, and foreign media or foreign public was wrongly taken to evaluate the situation in Kazakhstan. I think the main challenge for the nation, for President Tokayev, is these economic hardships and the growing economic disparity, the growing gap between the rich and the not rich. I think he has tried his best to address those top priority challenges in his address on the 11th of January. Everyone noticed that his address was economic injustice, inequality, disparity focused. That was clear. He has touched the most painful pockets of concerns by general public in terms of the economic well-being and situation in Kazakhstan, and he tried to make sure that public heard that he understands them very well and he takes them very deep to the heart. Therefore, I think the biggest challenge is for him to deliver on this very ambitious economic program at the core of which will be economic justice and equality. He, of course, reconfirmed his commitments for further political reform. I think he is very sincere and very genuine in his remarks and promises in this regard. The difficult task, of course, is for him to ensure that these commitments are delivered on a proper scale. Second misbelief or myth that Kazakhstan is surrendering its sovereignty is, of course, we witnessed today the quick withdrawal of CSTO forces, and I think this is also an answer to those who have already buried the signature multi-vector policy of Kazakhstan. I don't think, particularly with President Tokayev, who is a seasoned diplomat, I don't think that we have to say goodbye to the multi-vector policy. Kazakhstan, of course, will have to have excellent, very close relations with its neighbors, particularly two big neighbors, Russia and China. But I think, and I'm sure that Kazakhstan will continue to be open to all four sides of the world and will continue to balance its foreign policy with all the partners. Although these days it is absolutely difficult to balance for countries like Kazakhstan against the background of outrageous standoff between the West and the East, between the West and two big neighbors of Kazakhstan, Russia and China. Now I come to the, excuse me. Now I come to the most difficult question. What really happened? Who were the perpetrators? Who stood behind this violence in Kazakhstan, particularly in Almaty? And what has really happened? I think my frank assessment of the situation is that there is no one, even President Tokayev in Kazakhstan, who really understands or has full answers to this question. This is the most difficult part. He made certain hints in his statement in the parliament. We have some pointers in the day-to-day life, like senior arrests, etc., etc. But I think it will be very difficult to claim that anyone possesses the full picture of what has happened in Kazakhstan. You heard, of course, we all know that there is a special commission which will investigate everything and will try to bring truth to the ground. I think with this skepticism of huge pockets of public towards government, there is concern whether this commission will be powerful enough and efficient enough to produce full truth, but there is a hope. And I think that President Tokayev understands that ensuring that this commission is quick, transparent, professional, open, and unbiased will augment very seriously his economic program, which he announced in his speech in the parliament. I think these two things come together, and the government of Kazakhstan clearly understand that at this critical turning point in our history, and the history here, I should tell you, the history is not disrupted or abrupted. The history continues. Nothing will be flushed away. We have to take, we have to have the courage to take things in their entirety. That's the most challenging task for President Tokayev and his government, to make sure that there is a continuity and fair answers and courage to look into the very difficult facts into the face. This is the situation. Unfortunately, blood was shed. That's the most unfortunate thing in all this story, very sad story. But I think we are witnessing a real moment of turning a new page, a real new page in the history of Kazakhstan. This coincided, unfortunately, with the end of the first phase of 30 years development of Kazakhstan. The new generation has grown up, and I think this is the time when quality changes are to happen. But again, I stress that There should be no speculation that there are conspiracies, that the government is trying to hide something. I think it's in the interest of the government to be as open as it is possible, and they're trying to send signals that they're doing this. In the coming days, we see the social networks are full of very stupid, sad stories about violence, about the misbehavior by police now with people in custody, etc., etc. I tell you, this we have to go through. This is the most difficult questions to which the government genuinely doesn't have any answers, but it's very eager to find these answers and answer these questions. I invite everyone to trust this new signs of hope which are being sent by the government, and I think this is a moment when this is an opportunity for the nation to come together at these difficult times. And I think my personal take of the situation is optimistic. Crises happen, but they bring something new, and they open opportunities for the growth and change in positive terms.
Thank you, Elan. I'm conscious of time. You'll notice that there are lots of resources being added into the chat box. Many of those are on the Oxus website, and in fact, some also in the Royal Society of Asian Affairs journal. So please consult there too. I'm going to consolidate lots of questions rather than picking individually. I'd probably like to say that often Kazakhstan, Central Asia gets always viewed through the prism of what Russia and China are doing. I'm going to ignore all of those for now, because this is a Kazakh story that I think is more important from this side, rather than to ask what Russia's designs might be. If you pester Michael Ryder and the RSAA, we could try and do that again. It's so nice to see so many people here today. I've got two direct specific questions, and I'd be grateful, I think, for the panelists to come in with questions to each other, and above all to the ambassador. One for Your Excellency is what is the current status with President Nazarbayev himself? We've not heard anything from him. Can you give us any update on Nazarbayev himself?
I'm sitting in London, but I'd like to say that we don't have any reason to disbelieve what we see from Nur Sultan, from our capital. His press secretary and many officials have confirmed that the first president is in Kazakhstan, that he is safe, that he is in touch and full coordination with President Tokayev. Actually, he's calling on public through different means to support the new agenda of President Tokayev. So this is what we all hear from Kazakhstan, and I don't see any reasons to believe, and I don't believe in these conspiracy theories.
Okay, I'm not asking for conspiracy theory. I'm just conscious of how important Nazarbayev has been in the 30 years of Kazakhstan's independence, and in fact before then too, and just wondering whether we might hear from him or an update. But thank you for that. I do recognize it's difficult to be getting a full picture. Second, something that Kate Mallinson mentioned at the beginning about an independent investigation into what happened. I know this will happen from the Kazakh side. What do you think that investigation, what kind of changes might that spark in Kazakhstan? I mean, you know, I think as well as all of us, the push for higher levels of social reform, civic activism, and so on. Do you think that we should be hopeful about the coming months and years, that this will be a moment which will improve some of those freedoms? Or do you think this is a moment where from the top down, there will be a need to try to work out what's going on, and therefore important to keep people in prison to find out what's gone on, and then slowly let the oxygen back into the system? Do you think this is a moment where more reforms will happen, or do you think that things will slow down? I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts.
My thought is definitely that this is, as I told, the opportunity for qualitative change and stepping over into a new phase of 30 years of future development. As I told you, I reconfirmed that I believe that President Tokayev and his government believe that independence and unbiasedness and professionalism of this commission is a very important factor which will augment President Tokayev's economic and social and political agenda of reforms. But they're not linked to each other. I think President Tokayev has clearly came up with a very forward-looking reform program, focusing particularly on the economic well-being of common people, bringing justice. And this he wants to do through very clear and understandable and tangible means, like establishing this special fund for simple people, unaccountable to the government, accountable and transparent to the public. And he is genuine to carry on with his political reforms, which he started, but he is a proponent of the evolutionary method. There will be no abrupt jumps at these reforms. So in essence, I don't think that what he declared 2 years ago will change. There will be maybe one change. There will be more space for him to implement those reforms. And I think what he outlined in his speech on the 11th of this January is a very good pointer to what he's going to do in the future. And the professional work of this investigation commission will only augment what he's trying to do.
Joanna, I know you have a question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Idrisov. Pleasure to see you and to be on the panel with you. My question is this. Now, you mentioned that there's a lot of confusion and nobody really knows what happened. I totally agree. But going back to this question of impunity, I actually have spoken to a very well-placed source with direct access to President Tokayev, who told me that President Tokayev does, if not know, strongly suspect who is responsible for this. And we're going back again to the Nazarbayev family. Now, I'm not going to name any names further than that, but I do trust my source. So why, my question is this, why is President Tokayev not going public? Is he afraid? Is it not more frightening for him perhaps not to go public and to let these people have impunity? And is there not a danger that creates a danger for his own personal security, but also for Kazakhstan as a country, now that we've seen what kind of chaos these forces can unleash? Thank you.
Joanna, thank you very much. I know that you were stuck at the Kyrgyz border and we were trying to help you. I was in touch with your colleagues in The Economist, and I'm happy that you are eventually there. And it was not that we wanted to stop foreign journalists to come to Kazakhstan. It was simply a situation of the emergency situation, and that border was simply closed for everyone. And you were stuck with that situation. And I'm very glad that our efforts went through and you are finally in Kazakhstan. I don't think, we all know President Tokayev for many years. He is there for all these 30 years, and he was one of the closest associates and colleagues and companions of President Nazarbayev in building the nation. Therefore, this is one thing. A second thing is we do not have to forget that those who we saw on the streets, this is not the entire population of Kazakhstan. It's a society. It's a multi-level, multifaceted, multi-emotional society. So you have different generations, you have different origins. Therefore, quick, abrupt decisions, which are not characteristic of Tokayev himself, we should remember. They will not be helpful in this situation. Therefore, I think by his character, he is taking caution. He does not want to overturn the situation even further. He does not want to worsen the situation. We all know that such difficult questions are very difficult to answer. Let's recall the questions we had to answer about the Stalin period. Let's even recall the situation, what happened last January in Congress on the Capitol Hill. Do we have all the answers? No. Do we have all the answers what happened here in UK in August of 2011 when there was massive violence and there was arrest of more than 3,000 people, and there were no attacks then on military weapons warehouses, no attacks on airports, etc., etc. So the situation very unstable yet in Kazakhstan. All the normality is coming back, but terrorists are there. They scattered all around, and the counter-terrorism operation is going on. But Tokayev wants to build to fertile the ground for implementing his economic reform, which he announced. The government is tasked with these difficult things, and this is, we should understand that this comes in the times of economic hardships with limited budgets, etc., etc. Therefore, I think he has a very full a very full and very challenging plate. I don't think that he will be rushing at things. You know, even with this 10,000 detentions, we are being criticized why they're being detained, etc., etc. But you know, the tendency with our law enforcement agency is to be as open as possible, and most of the people are being released. They're being just admonished administratively, but most of them are being released. But there are huge amounts of people who are under suspicion because they don't produce where they come from, with what designs they come from, with what plans they came from. Therefore, there should be a very serious investigation into all these facts. Therefore, unfortunately, we have to go through this very difficult period when there will be many uncertainties, many answers, questions will not be answered, but there should be no suspicion that the government is trying to hide something. I think.
Sorry.
Yes.
I beg your pardon.
I once again insist that we should discard these stories that the government is trying to hide something, and again do all this old-style Soviet, you know, conspiracy behavior. I'm strongly against that, and I don't believe in this.
Kate, you've just put in the chat box that your comment for Chatham House has just been published on your position on Kazakhstan. Could you say could you just do two things? First, to give your view on the CSTO. A few people have been asking about that. But then could you elaborate a bit more on Kazakhstan's reputation in tatters that you said so powerfully at the beginning? Because I think some of the discussion is about the reality check of what is it that has really just happened? Has this been a seismic shock that took everybody by surprise? Or is this a palace coup that actually is going to be a shuffling at elite level only, and there's not going to be an enormous amount of change? It's just new people on in fact, not necessarily even new people behind the same desks. In some cases, as you mentioned, 11 out of 17 of the cabinet have been there before. To tell us what you meant by reputation tatters, but also if you could give some idea about CSTO, how you do place that within the kind of wider context of why relatively small numbers of troops were called in the first place. How would you understand that?
The question to me, right?
No, I think to Kate Mallinson, please.
Yeah.
But I also think the ambassador can probably answer better than me on the CSTO. I mean, I think initially it was a shock because one of President Nazarbayev's greatest achievements was how well he balanced the major powers, including Russia, China, and the West for 30 years, a very kind of difficult accomplishment when taking into consideration the natures of some of these countries. And you know, from the beginning, he entrenched Kazakhstan's sovereignty by bringing in lots of foreign investors, and you know, it was a great course that he stuck to. So at the beginning, that was very worrying when overnight that seemed to be ripped up, that multi-vector policy. But I think it will continue. I think President Tokayev, that will be, you know, a concern of his. But as I've said before, I think nothing comes free with Vladimir Putin, and he was probably punching the air when he got the call from President Tokayev to about bringing CSTO troops in, because we all know about his kind of, you know, his spheres of influence and his desires for them. So I think it does worry people what the implications are. But I think I was very glad to see that they left quickly as promised. And so I think the ambassador might want to add to that later. But just on the international reputation, yes, I think Kazakhstan, you know, the government was very clever at promoting Kazakhstan as a modernizing, ambitious country. And it was part of this sort of simulation, this sort of gulf between the haves and the have-nots, the people, the grassroots who are complaining with the genuine protests about the lack of opportunity. I was always told the word "yes, perspektiven," without the perspectives. People just felt that that there were no opportunities for them, their children, their grandchildren, and this manifested itself in a massive brain drain that rose annually. And I think, you know, it's this dissonance and the dichotomy between this and what the PR companies have promoted about Kazakhstan, which is, you know, is a fabulous country with incredible natural resource wealth. But what we saw in Almaty, what we still can't hear the names of what actually happened, you know, we still, you know, need to hear from the government at some point their version. was terrifying. Paid mercenaries on the street, organized criminal elements, which had suddenly, had obviously been organized to come onto the streets in advance. So I think, particularly when companies are looking at sort of ESG issues and, concerns about their reporting, I think they are very kind of worried about what's happened and will need a lot of reassurance about what lies ahead.
Thanks, Kate. Listen, I'm very conscious of time. Like I said, it is a wonderful thing to host events like this, and very generous of the speakers to give up their time when they have other commitments too. So I think it would be great if you'd like to hear from us or hear more again to please ask Oxus and RSAA to do something more. I think I'd like to finish with asking our two young Kazakh panelists, Rashan and Alimana. I mean, it's always terrifying hearing people saying they're born in 1996. It's sort of incomprehensible to me that people can be that young and that accomplished. But how we heard about, as Kate said, the brain drain, the problem about young, smart Kazakhs leaving and going abroad. What are your hopes on the back of these last traumatic couple of weeks? The many who have lost their lives, the many who've been taken into custody, I suspect many of them unfairly, but some of them presumably for good reason, and we'll find out in due course. What are your hopes and expectations? Give us the best case scenario. I think it's the beginning of a year, so we won't have the worst case. What's the best case scenario for, I don't know, 20 years time if we were all sitting gathered here again? What would you like the January 2022 uprisings, revolts, revolution, changing of the guard, whatever it might be, to achieve? Maybe if I come to Alimana first and Rashan.
Okay. I just want to start by saying that I'm a big patriot of my country. That's why I'm studying Kazakhstan a lot and I'm writing articles about it. And I'm just very curious of to learn more about, even though I was born in Kazakhstan and grew up there, to learn more about other issues that we have and kind of contribute to the betterment of it. So from that perspective, I would really like to see the growing generation, the generation of like Roshan and I, and a bit above us who were lucky enough to, for example, enjoy the beautiful programs that our government actually provided us, like Bolashak, Nazarbayev universities and other opportunities, because they did that. And we actually got, like Roshan herself, she studied at Nazarbayev University, that we, thanks to that, we learned English, we could travel, we could study, we got hold of all these opportunities, but now we need to use these opportunities to contribute to the country's development. And that's where the problem comes in, right? Because then it's harder to realize ourselves in the governmental organizations. And for example, I myself working internationally and working abroad. And there's another aspect to it is that, for example, in the new cabinet, we can only see one female minister, which is also raises questions about the female aspect and the glass ceiling inside the country, even though like both of us are very ambitious. We also always think about, will we be able to like realize our political ambitions inside the country? Or perhaps it would be easier to go and work for international organization like UN or OEC or somewhere else, or for a think tank. And then basically Kazakhstan loses our talent, not us specifically, but many other examples that I see from my friends that are working also abroad, but not being contribute to the development of Kazakhstan because of that aspect of of us being, for example, females or having different views. And I actually wrote an article about the brain drain from Kazakhstan, especially to Russia, as it's also very important to highlight. So yeah, it's but I'm hopeful. I think it's a big trauma for us what happened in Kazakhstan in the beginning of this year, but I also hopeful that this trauma will kind of leave its trace in like a good way in terms of like uniting and being more interested in what's happening in Kazakhstan and being more interested in contributing to the development of the events in Kazakhstan from this point. And I'm in the best case scenario, of course, if we just don't forget and kind of get involved in like trying to just figure out what happened and trying to make sense using this all different evidence that we have, as there's no clear picture exactly for us, as there are many different elements. yeah, if we just be able to go past that and actually come back to what the protests have wanted initially, and kind of see government to addressing that and to addressing the real issues that we kind of compiled through that 30 years of independence that we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Rashan. I don't know if you want to add anything. I'm very conscious of time, but if you want to have a flourish of a sign off too, it's always important to hear from the younger panelists, and no disrespect to my very distinguished colleagues.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll be short. I share the same sentiments with Alimana. I feel like a lot of us studying abroad are like pretty patriotic about our country. It's just unfortunately the opportunities there are sort of limited. And even if you go there, there is always a possibility of glass ceiling, as Alimana has mentioned. Another thing, sorry, that I want to mention is that both of us were fortunate enough to get the education that we have. I just wish that the opportunities that we had, they were distributed to the regions. I was born in Astana, and was fortunate enough to get the education I have. But a lot of people in rural areas, in other regions, they unfortunately don't have that opportunity. So it's something that the government also probably, I hope, will work on.
Thank you very much. I'm incredibly grateful. There's a real range of views, perspectives, expertise. I can see there is some chatter in the chat box saying that this is not the level of analysis expected. I'm both shocked and surprised by that, but you can't win them all. I think that hearing Kazakhstan, its reputation as being in tatters, hearing from young people, hearing from someone on the ground in Almaty who's been into the city hall this morning, and from the ambassador trying to represent the government's view, I think that we're very fortunate to have that diversity. So I'm really grateful to Kate, to Joanna, to Alimana, to Rashan, and to His Excellency Ambassador Idrisov, to Michael Ryder and the RSAA and its trustees, and to the Oxus Society for arranging this. I think that was terrific. There's so much more we could talk about. There are a lot of unknowns in all of this. I don't think anybody has any illusions about the problems about top-down reform that are needed in Kazakhstan. I know that personally from many discussions with the ambassador personally over many years. The question is how to do that, and how to do that in a way that avoids some of the scenes that we've seen in the last couple of weeks. I hope for the Kazakhs in the audience and for everybody listening, that we do see a return to peace in Kazakhstan, that the situation stabilizes, that these investigations are really important. The more transparent and open they are, the better. I suspect our Anglo-Saxon views about transparency may be slightly more demanding than you might be used to in the post-Soviet world, but I say that also knowing that we have our own problems at the moment about these kinds of inquiries too, but that needs to be more than whataboutery. It's a different story about having parties while people should be locked down to people losing their lives and having their civic liberties taken away. It's a seismically different exercise. But I do recognize that getting to the bottom of the facts is important. I think this time, a couple of weeks ago, many of us feared that things would be much, much worse than they have been. Stability is important, but we do need, I think, to see some of those social reforms and some more relaxation of the ways of tolerances in which different voices can be heard. So I'm very grateful to all of you for joining me today on the panel. Very grateful for you giving up your time. I know how much demand there is, and thank you for everybody for listening today. We hope to see you again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all for your participation. I'm sorry that time did not allow for the panel to address all the questions that you've raised. I have the feeling, though, that this is an area where we're going to be returning to before long, certainly many in the chat channel who asked for us to do that. Separately, the next RSAA event will be on the 2nd of February, when our series of talks on culture, conflict and recovery will start with the theme of sport, the arts and community in Iraq. You can find the details on the RSAA website, and I hope that we'll see many of you again then. But for now, I would just like to thank Peter Frankopanm and all of our panelists for an extremely engaging, informative, thought-provoking discussion. You'll be able to see a recording of this on the RSAA YouTube channel within the next 24 hours, and a transcript is also available. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.